Welcome to Thursday lunchtimes at the LSA. That means Thursday lunchtime talks, and our online series. We are now in our 12th week of the series from term one, which is quite incredible to think we've got here quite so fast. But to all of you who have been following, thank you very much for returning, and for anybody who's joining us for the first time, really pleased to see you here. Last week we had the great insights and privilege to speak to Amir Nouri, who was a former student at the LSA, but is now really working in the fields of AI and AR, augmented reality and artificial intelligence, and using that to produce imagery, and looking at design opportunities for architects in those fields. So an incredible sort of breadth of knowledge, typical of the series. Next week, we will be hearing from the Department of Education, who will talk about being an intelligent client, shaping the future school estate. The Department of Education are working with one of our design teams in design think tanks, one of our modules this year. So as a client on that think tank, so we're really, really pleased to have them involved, and look forward to hearing more from them next week, or on perhaps why they're involved with us at the LSA and teaching. But more to this week, have great privilege and delighted to welcome award-winning architects, LSA Founding Practice, Grimshaw Architects, to showcase their commitment and methods in delivering net zero projects. This week is called Navigating a Path to Net Zero Carbon and Beyond. The talk will be presented by Peter Swallow. Welcome, Peter. Sustainability lead for Europe and the Middle East. And so we will hear about the challenges and successes of achieving net zero buildings by 2025 and creating regenerative spaces by 2030. No mean feat. Peter is also technical advisor at the UK's first net zero building standard, and participates in the multidisciplinary recourse entitled Recourse Efficiency in Construction and Built Environment Group at the University of Cambridge, which look forward to hearing a little bit more about. He will be specifically discussing the tools that his team at Grimshaw's are developing to support the practice's decarbonisation pathways and knowledge hub, all of which is just incredibly pertinent material, topic, subject matter for the day that COP28 begins in the United Arab Emirates. So please, as always, put your questions in the chat. There will be time for questions at the end. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Peter. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I'm just going to load my screen here. Hopefully you can all see that. So, as I said, thank you very much, Samantha, for inviting me. Delighted to be here today. Looking forward to presenting and doing the Q&A at the end of this presentation. As I said, my name is Peter Swallow. I am the sustainability lead here at Grimshaw, based in our London studio. I'm responsible for our European and Middle Eastern operations, and I've been working in the role now for coming up to 4 years. So I'm going to take you on a journey through, as a sort of practitioner's perspective, on the work we've done to navigate the path to net zero, the work that we've done to date, the work that we need to do. There's still plenty of work to do, and then looking beyond net zero at what we need to do beyond there to make sure that we develop a world that is regenerative, and not just address the climate emergency, but also go beyond that to create a world where we're creating a positive impact and not just minimising our impact. So before I begin getting to the detail of that, I thought it was worth just giving you a quick overview of who we are as a practice. Grimshaw is a global practice operating out of 8 studios, with London being our largest. We've got over 600 staff, and we've been in operation now for over 40 years, and we've in that time amassed a number of awards for a number of our world-class projects. Some you will hopefully be familiar with. The one in the middle top there, hopefully you will be probably our most recognisable project, the Eden project, which we completed back in the turn of the millennium, as a project that really was an opportunity for us to develop some of our thinking and thought leadership around sustainability back then. And obviously a lot has changed and developed in that space since. We are well known for our infrastructure work. We recently delivered the renovation and reconfiguration of London Bridge Station, which was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize a few years ago. But we do work across all sectors. We also operate in aviation, culture, education, workplace and residential. So we have a breadth of experience, and our sort of USP, the reason clients come back to us time and again, is that we are very good at synthesizing very complex briefs, spatial requirements, and trying to create a solution that works for all the different stakeholders. So that's something that we do time and time again, which obviously lends itself very well to infrastructure projects, but there are other sectors where that sort of thinking can reap rewards, as you can see through our portfolio sort of snapshot here. Sustainability itself, we've had a long history in terms of trying to be at the forefront of delivering sustainable buildings, going right back to our founder, Nick Grimshaw, and his work that he did with Buckminster Fuller and delivering materially efficient buildings, looking at off-site construction, and some of our sort of early work, which I'll touch on later in this presentation, really sort of is testament to that. But there's just a snapshot here of some of the work that we've done over the last 40 years. The British Pavilion is probably a milestone that was delivered for the Seville Expo back in 1992. That building was off-grid, used passive cooling, had a waterfall that ran down the facade, which cooled the building and allowed the internal spaces to be moderated with using as little energy as possible. And then going through, as I mentioned, Eden earlier, the Eden project was then another milestone project for us, delivered sort of 10 years later, which was looking at taking a former open clay pit and restoring and regenerating that into a positive contribution to the area that the site was located in. And more recently, we've delivered the Woodside building in Melbourne for Monash University, which is the Southern Hemisphere's largest passive house certified scheme, which has a very, very it's a large achievement for such a heavily service building that has a lot of labs, a lot of cooled spaces. So it's a huge challenge, and one where the client wasn't originally invested in that as an outcome, but we worked closely with the contractor and delivered that as a added value to the project. So there's a lot of history, a lot of knowledge that we have in the practice, but we're always looking to the next challenge and trying to expand our horizons and trying to understand where we can take that knowledge, build on it, and offer something to our clients. So in terms of where we currently are within the climate emergency, I'm sure I don't need to go into the detail of the context of the climate emergency, but it is worth just touching on it very briefly in terms of the numbers and why the built environment and construction industry need to act in this area. So what you can see on the screen here is a graph that was developed by the Stockholm Resilience Institute. And it's worth considering that the last 100 years of improvements around social and health indicators has really been at the detriment to planetary systems. And what the Stockholm Institute are trying to encapsulate in this diagram is that there are a number of planets, 9 in total, and of those 9 they've been trying to quantify what they are and understand where we sit in regards to those planetary boundaries being healthy. And you can see that as of their latest version of this diagram, 6 of the 9 boundaries have been crossed quite significantly. And obviously climate change affects biodiversity, and it will eventually affect society if it continues to worsen unabated. So we really do need to grapple with that problem. We need to understand how to deal with the source of that issue, and it's greenhouse gas emissions. And as an industry, it's worth understanding the impact that we have. If you look at global greenhouse gas emissions, the built environment, which is represented by the orange segments on this graph here, this graph represents all the different industries and their contributions to annual greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that almost 40% is attributed in some way to the built environment, either through buildings in operation or their construction. And when you factor in the manufacture of steel and concrete and aluminium, it pushes that contribution up to almost 50% of the problem. So the built environment and those that operate within that space, contractors, designers, clients, asset owners, we really do need to come together, and we need to act fast in order to minimize our contribution to the problem. So it was within that context that back in 2019, our chairman, Andrew Wally, at the World Architecture Festival, announced that Grimshaw was declaring a climate and biodiversity emergency. We became signatories to that initiative, and we set out 3 commitments that the practice were going to follow and pursue in order to address and contribute to minimising our impact and the impact of our designs on the planet. And those are captured here. The first being that we would operate as a carbon neutral business from 2020, which we are doing. We are currently on the road to delivering net zero carbon ready projects and reporting the carbon impact of those projects by the end of 2025. And then beyond that, we're looking at not just minimising impact. We've done, as you've seen from the charts from the Stockholm Institute, that damage has been done, and we need to regenerate and we need to rectify the damage that's been caused in pursuit of delivering a regenerative built environment. So that is why we're also by 2020 looking to make sure that all of our projects are having a positive impact, not just minimising their negative impacts. So we're looking at developing a framework in order to make sure our designs are adhering to that philosophy. I mentioned that we signed up to the Architects Declare back in 2019 to support that and to support our commitments. We also are members of the World Green Building Council's Advancing Net Zero initiative. We contribute to organisations such as Architects Climate Action Network through talks and lectures and roundtable discussions. We've signed up to science-based targets for our own scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, and because of the impact we have through specification of materials, we're also signatories to Concrete Zero and Responsible Steel, which is about creating demand for products that are decarbonised within those industries. So having set those commitments, the first task we needed to do was understand what could we do within our practice to change the way that we design buildings. So we set up a climate emergency task force, which was a cross-practice group that we consulted in order to understand what sort of tools do we need to develop to help our project leads, what sort of information do we need to clarify definitions of even the definition of net zero carbon. At the time, there was no clear definition of what we meant ourselves by net zero carbon ready. So that was the first thing that the group was tasked with doing, was to create a framework or definition of what net zero meant and what ready meant. So for us, net zero means whole life net zero carbon. It means the combination of operational energy, but also embodied carbon of a project. And those two combined create a picture of what the whole life carbon contribution of that project is. We then looked at understanding what the science-based reduction targets would need to be against each of those components of whole life carbon. So we could give our clients and our design teams guidance on what sort of level of reduction that needs to be achieved. And I'll come on to some of the complexities and things that you need to watch out for when you're setting targets later in the presentation. So that was our framework that we set. It also dealt with the difference between being ready, net zero carbon ready versus being net zero carbon certified. Essentially, net zero carbon, to be net zero carbon certified, you have to have not only reduced your carbon from operational and embodied components, you then need to take the residual carbon of your project, you need to offset it. There's controversies around offsetting schemes and the application of offsetting, and I'll touch on those maybe in the Q&A session if people are interested in that. So that was the framework that we set up, the definition of what net zero was, really as a mechanism for our design leads to be able to have informed conversations with our clients, particularly our clients that weren't necessarily setting net zero as an agenda. The clients who have set net zero as an agenda, very often they also don't have the background knowledge to actually know what to do to implement a plan of action to actually achieve net zero, or understand the impact of targets and the knock-on consequences to cost and program, etc., that they may have. So this was a really good starting point to start that conversation. The second output that the group developed was a pathway, which was really a guidance that surmised all of the guidance that is currently out there. And there's a lot of guidance. This slide doesn't do it justice, but there is a plethora of guidance in globally across different regions. Some of it is fantastic. Some of it is behind, and different regions are working at different paces to build up their guidance they provide on the ground, and the advocacy work they do to push for legislation to ensure that net zero carbon is on the agenda at the government level. But what we were trying to do was take all of that complexity and synthesize that down into one place that you could start. And that became our decarbonisation pathway. We actually had 4 pathways that cover the different scales of projects that we work at. The first being master planning, then looking at infrastructure projects, buildings and industrial design. Those are the sort of scales of projects that we work at. You can see here a snapshot of our buildings pathway. And for those of you who are familiar with the REBA plan of works, we tried to work to that format that was familiar to architects. So we go through the banner at the top there, you can see the different REBA stages. And this was an interactive tool, so they could be swapped out using the filters on the left-hand side to switch out the region. So we had covered Australasia, we covered North America, because those are regions that we operate quite extensively in. So you could see the different contexts of what the different work stages were. And then for each of those work stages, we set out specific actions that needed to be addressed at those stages. And those actions came with guidance. So for each action, if you clicked on it, you would get a pop-up that would tell you what needed to be done, who was responsible for doing it, and how to go about executing that action. And the actions are broadly grouped into 6 activities that run across all design stages and construction and operation of a project. And we color-coded it in such a way to sort of give people a snapshot of what the subject matter was for those actions. And essentially, they fall into 3 categories. We've got activities that are about management of carbon, reporting and validation. They are the ones you see there in the turquoise color. And then we've got actions that relate to developing and optimizing the operational performance of a building and the embodied carbon. And against these 6 activities, we could then start to work with our designers on pilot projects to understand them, where we needed to refine the information that we were collating for them to refer to, and where we could streamline the number of actions. Because you can see here from the pathway snapshot that I have, we were getting on to about 90 actions, which when you divide that by the number of work stages is a sort of not too many per stage, but when you see them collectively over all REBA stages, it's quite a lot of information to take in. We also made sure that this information wasn't just coming from ourselves and our own interpretation. So we did extensive consultation with industry to make sure that the actions that we were outlining, the guidance we were providing behind them, was vetted by the wider industry, so we could have some confidence that when we went to clients, we had the conversations with them, that we were actually on the right track and we were knowledgeable about what we were talking about, and it was current information. So having developed those 2 really important tools to help our project leads navigate the journey that their projects were going to take on through net zero, we set up some early adopter pilot projects. Because of the nature of projects taking a number of years to complete, particularly with COVID over the last few years, a lot of projects stopped and started. We were never going to have a project that was going to go through all of those activities in a short amount of time. So we looked across a number of projects, and when you look at them collectively, they have covered all of those activities that I described. And it gave us a really good insight into where we could refine and improve the information that we were giving to our design leads, and also get feedback from them on where they'd had successful conversations with clients and where they hadn't been successful in being able to convince clients to adopt a net zero carbon management plan. So what I want to do now is just very briefly take you through some of the insights we've gained over the last 4 years of this process of integrating net zero carbon management into our projects. I won't go into these in a huge amount of detail, but if anybody has an interest in knowing more, we can cover that in the Q&A session at the end. So if I go through the first activity, which is about establishing the scope of carbon management and the governance that goes behind that, it is really important up front to make sure that you have a client that understands the scope of carbon that you're trying to manage, be it operational, embodied, or whole life. Explaining to them where we're coming from in terms of our own commitments. We would always explain to them that regardless of their position, we would always be trying to manage and report on, internally at least, whole life carbon. And once we'd established the scope and we'd established who is doing what, who's responsible for each of the actions, we would put that together into a carbon management plan for the project. And the idea was that carbon management plan would be updated at each REBA stage, and then handed over, if needed, to a contractor and then to the building owner and operator at the end. There are 2 really useful insights to take away from this. The first is setting up a responsibilities matrix on who's doing what and when is really helpful to understand where there might be gaps in scope for the commission design team and understand what additional services need to be included. Things like energy modelling are often not included in terms of going beyond code compliance. And looking at things like PAS 2080, which is a publicly accessible standard, making sure that you're following a carbon management framework can be really helpful. PAS 2080 is a really good starting point there. Target setting and setting benchmarks is quite a complex undertaking. There's some fantastic guidance that's been published by Letty and Reba, and they've worked very well together to sort of align their targets that they've set for commercial and for residential and for schools. But there are gaps. We don't have defined targets or limits for performance across all typologies of buildings, which is very difficult then to try and work out where's your starting point and how much as a percentage you're trying to reduce from that sort of business as usual starting point. So that's something to consider when you're setting targets, is how do you go about defining a reasonable target, and also trying to understand if you're pushing your targets to a sort of going to a stretch position, pushing the boundaries as it were, and going for something maybe beyond 50% before 2030. You've got to understand what the impact of that is from a cost perspective and really work with your client to understand what the cost impact of trying to push your targets beyond sort of where the wider industry is at the moment. There are some, as I said, there's some really good guidance out there. The UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which will be launching, I think, next year, will be another good document that's trying to address that gap in terms of setting targets and limits. And the Built Environment Carbon Database is another document that is a really useful database of projects that have been measured, both in terms of their building, their design performance, but also their operational performance, and also looking at products as well. I'll touch on operational energy briefly, only to say that you have to be aware that there is often a gap between the modelling that's done for compliance against, say, Part L or other equivalent codes in other regions versus the reality of the actual energy consumption of the building. And the only way you can understand what the real consumption is, you have to do a full dynamic energy model, and that is often not part of the scope of the design team at the outset, and it's something you have to watch out for and make sure you allow for that. It captures everything that's not regulated by building code, so often things like servers, office equipment and lifts are not included in those simplified energy models, so that's something to be aware of. And when you're doing embodied carbon analysis very early on, when you're trying to look at different systems and the benefits of different facade systems or different structural systems, however you go about that comparative analysis, you have to be consistent in the approach that you take. The example I give on the screen here is an example from a piece of work I did back in 2015, where at a time where there wasn't tools like OneClick, and it was a task I took on and very quickly realized the scale of that task. It took me about 2 weeks to collate the data from the various different databases that were available back then. There was the ICE database, then trying to go through product literature, because there were very few energy product declarations that you could go to find the embodied carbon of products. So you had to go and backwards engineer the information that was available. So it's a task that you can't underestimate the time you need to put aside to do that analysis well, so you can get meaningful and informed results that can then inform the decision making that you make. So that's a really important one, I think, in terms of embodied carbon, both in terms of upfront and looking at operation and maintenance components of embodied carbon. That's a really important thing that you have to consider. And then in terms of measuring whole life carbon, so looking at carbon not just from embodied but also operational in combination, it's important to note there's no universally agreed upon methodology for undertaking whole life carbon assessment. I've got some snapshots from a recent report that Rambold have done, looking at the different components in terms of life cycle stages that are captured in reporting across different regions, and you can see the variance between the different regions there. And also looking at the types of components that are captured in that sort of assessment vary significantly between different regions. Some capture comprehensively all the components of the building, others leave out a considerable number of components of a building. So you have to be aware of the methodology that you're applying. And in the UK, the best place to start is with the RICS Whole Life Carbon Assessment for the built environment. That is a very comprehensive methodology that captures the significant components in the building. And again, when the net zero carbon building standard comes online, that will complement the RICS guide and provide further guidance. And finally, I will just wrap up in terms of insights around these activities, just to say that in terms of commissioning and validating a building, it's incredibly important to make sure that your commissioning phase of a project is following a framework and making sure that that's an extended period. So when I say a framework, I mean an example would be the UK government soft landings framework. It maps out a comprehensive process for making sure you're testing and commissioning the services and the systems within a building, and also making sure you've got at least a 2-year period of refinement and optimization and post-occupancy analysis that's happening after the building's handed over and is operating. And that's really important to complement the compliance gap that I spoke about earlier, to make sure that the performance gap between what you've modelled at the design stage the building should be doing in terms of energy consumption and what the building's doing in reality. So that's a really important component. The last part I'll just wrap up on in terms of insights is to say that there are limitations in where you can go to get officially certified for net zero. At the moment, the ILFI's Living Buildings Challenge is the only scheme that provides a zero carbon certification for operational embodied carbon, but their targets are they're not necessarily 1.5 degree aligned, so that's something to watch out for. Otherwise, there is no standard really that has it is a go-to, so that's something to consider if a client is looking for certification. And offsetting is another contentious issue. There's a lot of really good guidance that you can share with clients from the UK GBC, the Environment Agency, and the GLA. They all provide guidance on how to go about offsetting. So hopefully those insights have been useful. In terms of our own journey and the application of the pathway to date in the practice, we every 6 months we take a health check of all of our projects, and you can see here our latest health check, which was taken back in August of this year. You can see the number of projects that have set targets, the number of projects that are achieving net zero carbon ready at the design stage against those targets, and the number of projects that are going online that have achieved net zero carbon ready in operation. And you can see there that we have we've made progress year on year, but you can see the hill that we have to climb to get to 100% of our projects achieving net zero carbon ready by the end of 2025. So in order to accelerate that, we're looking at building capacity within our practices, within our studios, to better collect data, to analyze project data, so we can have a quicker feedback loop, but also looking at bringing on specialists. And this is something I didn't touch on earlier, but in terms of life cycle assessment, it is a very specialist activity. It's not something to be undertaken lightly. It's sort of equivalent in complexity to doing a cost plan. So you need to know what you're doing. So we are advocating to have a specialist within our team to start moderating the different assessments that we've done to date, and also applying a sort of a level of rigor that means that we've got consistency amongst what we're reporting internally. So a lot to do, but we're confident, and we're making inroads, and we've got the tools we now need, and we've got building capacity within our projects to make sure that we can deliver. The last thing that I'll talk about before I move on from net zero is to talk about this is a complex issue, and a problem shared obviously is a problem halved. We're very conscious that this information that we're gathering in this capacity that we're building is shared with the wider industry. So we are, as Samantha mentioned, we're involved in the UK net zero carbon building standards development. We sit on the working groups developing top-down and bottom-up targets that will go into the standard for different typologies. And we're also involved in we have been involved in the most recent review and update to PAS 2080. We've sat on the committee looking at developing that, and it was previously focused on infrastructure, is now covering buildings, so it's a much more comprehensive and much more far-reaching carbon management standard, and has an accompanying guide which is very useful to give insights on how to set up a carbon management plan. So moving beyond net zero, going towards regenerative design is ultimately where we're trying to get to as a practice. We've got, as I said, a hill to climb to get to zero, and then we've got a period of time, 5 years beyond that, to then start to grapple with the idea of what on earth regenerative design is and how do we practically implement that at the project level. It's not something we've ignored. We are actively involved in trying to, where we can, start to look at regenerative practice and design within our studios. But the reason that is so important, just to re-emphasize, is if we don't decouple our improved health and well-being that we've achieved over the last 100 years from the detrimental impacts it's having on the environment, we're going to end up in the scenario of very quickly seeing our health and well-being decline as our environment declines. So we're going to go on the trajectory which is down towards a dystopian future. If we can course correct, we can be in a good place. We can head towards a good Anthropocene, and we can make sure that all the positive impacts that we're having through health and well-being is also spilling over into the planet and the health of the planet. So, talking about dystopian landscapes, the Eden project was one of our first probably experiences actually looking at regenerative design, although 20 years ago it wasn't discussed about in those terms. But we took a site that was a former open clay pit, and we worked with Tim Smith, who had the vision for Eden, and we developed this project into a positive outcome on multiple dimensions, from an economic success in terms of the local region and the money that it brought into the region through tourism, the ecological and biodiversity impact of regenerating that former clay pit, and creating the biomes to bring in education and improve knowledge base and understanding within the wider community of the impact that we have on our planet. So from that perspective, the project has been a resounding success, and we're looking to emulate that with future Eden projects, and we're working very closely with Eden to look at other sites and other opportunities. But the lessons from that are that you have to be clear on where the scale of impact is that you can have and what effect you can have. There are certain things that need to be done at a much larger scale to make sure that regenerative practice is disseminated throughout the built environment. And when you look at this from the perspective of the city scale, and you look at this on a global scale, and you look at the whole system in its sort of entirety, you realize you have to not just make impact at the local level, but you need to make sure that you're impacting and scaling this up. So initiatives like C40 are working with mayors across the world to make sure that they're focusing on delivering circular cities. And the construction industry and the built environment sort of impact and input into that is around creating circular cities and circular construction. We've been working over the last 4 years as part of the Circuit project, which is a EU-funded research project looking at circular construction in the built environment, looking at taking demonstrator projects within London, Copenhagen, Helsinki, and Hamburg, and demonstrating that by scaling up these projects, they can have an impact across those cities and across the rest of Europe, and showing that the business case for those projects is viable, so that we can dispel any concerns that contractors have. And it really touches on 3 components of circularity. We're looking at material reclaim, we're looking at adaptive reuse of existing buildings, and we're looking at designing construction systems and buildings that are flexible and adaptable so they can increase their service life. So we have to think about what can be done at the project level, but we also have to think about how that's scaled up, and looking at where we need to change legislation. We need to create incentives so that the wider built environment industry can come together to affect change. So how does all of this relate to developing projects? One of the things that we are conscious of is that we need to develop a framework similar to the approach we took to net zero. We need to create a framework because regenerative design is such a broad and such a complex issue. And sustainability generally is, but regenerative design just makes it that much more complex. So we looked at what's available out there in the industry and further afield in academia. The donut economics framework developed by Kate Raworth is a really good example of a regenerative framework. And it takes the UN Sustainable Development Goals, principally the ones focused on social impacts, and it takes the planetary boundaries, which I mentioned earlier, and it creates a operating space, what they call the donut, that's is space that we're trying to get to, where we're bringing up the social foundation or ceiling, the foundation of the social impacts, and bringing them up, improving them across multiple dimensions. Then we're also looking at where we've overshot certain planetary boundaries to bring those back into a safe operating space. The framework is a really good start, but there are some limitations in that it doesn't actually provide a practical way of actually executing meaningful strategies that can achieve what the framework's trying to set out to do. So we've taken that as a starting point. We've started then to build our own framework. So we've taken the principles set out in donor economics. We've also looked at existing certification schemes that are used on many building projects like LEED and BREEAM and WELL, and one that's becoming more common is the Living Buildings Challenge. And we've looked to try and synthesize those into our own framework, because that framework then, once it sets out the different topics, we're then looking to set strategies that can be adopted to achieve the outcomes that we're trying to achieve against those different subject matters. And we're looking to implement that, but one of the things you have to consider when you're implementing a framework is that there's a lot of steps to take in order to make sure that that framework leads to an outcome that you're aiming for. So from our perspective, as part of our wider work that we do with when we have the opportunity, as we try and set out a sustainability vision for a project, and we try to then codify that in a brief, and we then set out the steps that the project team can take on in order to make sure that they can integrate sustainable and regenerative design into all of our projects. And the principal steps here are understanding what the project drivers are at different scales, what the clients, wider stakeholders require, looking all the way up to regional and international drivers. Understanding then what impact they will have on the project, we can start to formulate a vision for the project and set out specific objectives. That then allows us to map that into our framework and understand what the specific targets are that we're trying to achieve against each of those objectives. And then once we have the targets that we're trying to achieve to demonstrate success against those objectives, we start to define strategies, actual implementable strategies at the project level that we can integrate into the design that will achieve those targets, which will demonstrate that we've achieved those objectives. And beyond that, then it's about, similar to what I talked about with net zero, it's very important to make sure we're tracking and monitoring at all stages of a project that we're on target or on track to achieve those objectives. And then it's about evidence-based outcomes. Once you have the tracking and the monitoring data, you can demonstrate evidence that you've achieved that outcome. So there's a big process behind that, and we're looking for opportunities where we can to develop and implement that. And one example, which I'll finish on, is the work we've been doing with the Eden project to develop the Eden Project North, which has been in the press recently. We've worked closely with a company called 3Adapt, who have been developing the regenerative framework for that project. And we've been working sort of hand in hand with them to understand what we can do on that project to maximise the regenerative potential of the project, and then feed that back into the other projects and the framework that we're developing. And that's something we're really keen to, wherever we have the opportunity, to try and roll out our own framework and then start to build, in a similar way that we have to the pathway for net zero, start to build our own repository of information. I'm just looking at time here. I think it's just left for me to say thank you very much, and I'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. An incredibly action-packed and dense presentation, a lot of information, and just incredibly fantastically synthesized, I would say, for all those potential users out there. It seems to me that this is just this incredible layer of work that goes on before we even start to think about space. And all the other bits that architecture is about and that's really driving those design decisions is an incredible piece of work. And I would say just an incredible tribute to the practice also to invest so much time and energy. And you touched on, the time it takes to do reliable research and analysis, and then bringing together those reliable sources. There are a number of questions, but I guess I just wonder a little bit more about that. And also you touched on this idea of the specialist and being a specialist in order to do that kind of work, or the kind of work that you are doing, to get your head around all of the complexities and to make sure it starts to make an impact on the projects that are coming through the office. And how you sort of see that that's changed the sort of shape of an architect's office now and going forward. Do you feel that change, or is it just by osmosis?
Yes, no, I think the when we started out trying to implement the pathway on projects, our sort of initial starting point was we need to set carbon champions up on all of our projects. So we need to identify someone on the team that will be the sort of the main filter or main conduit between myself and my other counterparts to make sure that they're on track and they're reporting their progress. But also the intention was that they would be undertaking some of the analysis. But it has, over time, particularly on some of the more complicated projects, you either end up in a situation where you need to have a specialist because of the amount of information you're working with. It's like with the energy modelling. You need someone who knows what they're doing to set that up. It's very similar to a degree with setting up a life cycle model. It's very easy with tools like OneClick to set up an account, go in and start making a calculation. But to actually do something that's got some integrity and robust reporting behind it, it takes a lot of time and it takes quite a bit of experience. It's like setting up a specification or setting up a cost plan. You have to have a certain degree of knowledge around, for instance, how to build up a wall, because that isn't something you can always just select from a list. You have to have a certain amount of knowledge, and we realized that quite early on, and we've started to advocate that we need to, where we don't have projects where there's a specialist on board, there's multiple consultants. Big infrastructure projects are a good example. Where we've got the small to medium-sized projects where we're trying to do it ourselves, we need to have some sort of internal governance or mechanism to make sure we're doing it consistently. So it has changed the dynamic. We are very keen as a practice. We don't want to silo these roles out and have people working on them independently of project teams. We want the knowledge to sit with the architects so it can inform their next projects.
So do you think that learning is coming really through the process of doing the projects, or are those members of the team doing that learning in other places? Are they learning as part of their architectural training, or are they doing specific kinds of courses in other areas? How does that work in reality?
It's been mixed. We early on, when we identified some of those early projects for piloting the pathway, we assigned carbon champions. We signed them up to have training in OneClick. But I think the key to it has been that you have to continually work on LCAs to really build up a knowledge base. And what often happens is it gets picked up at some point, maybe mid and end of stage. They do an analysis, then it's put down and forgotten about, and they pick it up again 6 months later at the end of the next stage, and you have to relearn how to, all the assumptions you've made, find your login for the tool. So it's one of these things, you have to be doing it consistently. But then you have the friction between architects don't necessarily want to specialize in doing LCA, but they want to be informed by it and have it inform the decision making. So there is that kind of tension between it, and it's something we're working through at the moment. I think I put that in one of the slides around one of the accelerators for us to achieve our commitment is around looking at maybe bringing in someone like we have the BIM specialists or energy performance specialists. We bring someone in that could maybe support that and then allow architects to continue designing, but being informed as they do so.
Yeah, great, thank you. Now there are some questions that have come in, so I'm going to just read them for you. First of all, a question that asks, how do you deal with standards for international projects, particularly if they don't have their own local national standards? And do you just apply UK standards as the only comparable benchmark?
I'm assuming this relates to specifically to embodied carbon, but in general, if there isn't legislation around limits or targets for operational embodied energy, our starting point is the framework that we developed. So we put a lot of effort into understanding what is the global need around setting targets. So at that global perspective, the rule of thumb is about a 50% reduction on anything you're designing between now and 2030. And then beyond 2030, you're looking at even larger reductions. So if you're taking a sort of baseline design, that's a sort of business as usual design as a starting point, you're looking to save roughly 50% of the embodied carbon and of the operational energy use. There are nuances to that, but that's a good starting point if you don't have on-the-ground data in the particular region you're operating in. But again, you can refer, a lot of the information that Letty and Reba have provided can be applied as a starting point, as a good foundation.
Thank you. I have another question that asks, what is Grimshaw's approach to safe embodied carbon, i.e. working with existing buildings? Is there a stronger drive to convince clients to make use of the existing since the emergency declaration?
Yeah, so this gives away the amount of knowledge I've retained about Pathway. So I think it's action 0.02 is challenging the project need. So you're looking at going back to the brief and understanding what are the drivers behind the brief that you've set out. And if that brief is saying we're doing new build as a starting point, what has led to that decision? Have you gone through a process of understanding if there's buildings that you can use that you already have in your portfolio, or buildings that you could acquire that exist that could accommodate your needs? So it's really upfront, and it ties in full circle to the end of use stage in the Pathway. Talks about looking at how to understand the opportunities of a building that's reaching end of life, what you can do, and looking at what you could do potentially with the materials, and looking at pre-demolition audits and things like that go into that.
Fantastic. I guess that just picking up on that point, I mean, Grimshaw's tackle a lot of large infrastructure projects, and you showed some of the sort of scale at which you work. I would imagine that particular area presents quite a challenge when working at scale, but then working with existing fabrics.
Yes, it certainly can do. Infrastructure is an interesting area because the strict definition of infrastructure is it's the roads, the rail lines, the power lines. It's not the actual sort of terminus. They sort of fall back into the world of buildings. But infrastructure is definitely an interesting area where we identify we have an impact, particularly on some of the projects where we're doing rail terminus or we're doing airport hubs. And we treat them as part of our buildings. We work to the same prescribed pathway, but we do acknowledge that a lot of the heavy lift in terms of carbon reduction will be coming from things like reducing, the linear kilometers of track that you might be laying or tunneling that you might be doing. They have huge impact. And when you look at often when I'm shown the data in a sort of pie chart format of where all the contributions of hotspots of carbon are, and the building represents a kind of single percentile in that bigger equation, and it's sometimes you have to go back to the project team and say, no, this might be such a small wedge of this bigger equation, but it's the public facing end. It's the end where people are going to be engaging with this infrastructure, and you have to make sure you put your best foot forward, and you try as hard as you can to do as good a job as you can within that wider context.
Thank you. I have one more here for now, I think. Still a little bit of time if anybody has any last questions, but the last one for now. Do Grimshaw conduct POEs? I think you did touch on this, Peter. If so, how have they influenced the in-house environmental policies and pathways that you've developed? And how often are these policies and pathways updated in general?
So we have undertaken POE ourselves on some projects where we've been interested in understanding the performance of them. We've had some projects, mainly university projects, where they've undertaken POE themselves and they've been willing to share the data. So that's been a fantastic source of information that we can feed back into the pathways. And we do, where we have information where we're understanding maybe that our energy efficiency is higher than was anticipated, we can then start to sort of unpick that and understand where the issue lies. Was it the kit that was ultimately put in that didn't meet the performance specification? Is it the environmental designs? The facade maybe has too much glazing to solid ratio, and we could have improved that. So trying to unpick that is often something we try and do to feed back to design teams. It's not something we do as much as we'd like to. As we've put it in the pathway, but often clients it's hard to make clients see the value. I mean, it's such a small amount of money often to register for. That there's the Leesman Index, which you can use, which is an online platform which has thousands of data points from various surveys that have been done across different organisations. They don't cost that much, but clients often don't see the value in it up front. So it's always something that's on our minds to try and get more of. But we're limited in our own resources for commissioning those sorts of things. But when the opportunity arises, we do. The second part of the question around how often do we update the pathways? So we update the pathways periodically, maybe once a year. I think the buildings pathway of the 4 that I talked about is probably the one that's most used. But one thing we're doing, we've realised that this tool is something that if we keep it to ourselves, we'll use it and maintain it. But there's more value in sharing. So we've committed to making the tool a free resource that will be online. So if you look out for announcements at COP next week, you will see some more information around our plans in collaboration with the World Green Building Council and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in terms of making this tool available for others to use. And we think that's really important. We think by putting it out there and allowing others to become part of that journey for updating and improving it, it'll have more impact. So keep an eye out for that next week in announcements, and maybe download it in time. You'll be able to download a copy and start to interrogate it in more detail yourselves.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I mean, it seems to me that well, that's a fantastic idea. I was going to ask you what your ambitions were for COP and what you hoped would be some of the outcomes. I would imagine the take-up of the tool would be a big one, and that seems to me the biggest part of the challenge, isn't it? Having sufficient tools, but used in common and in conjunction with each other, as opposed to everybody starting to build their own and firing off in different directions. That seems to be the kind of single most important task right now. And so for certainly it was really fantastic to see a sort of synthesis of certainly those diagrams, reliable sources where students can go and not have to kind of keep inventing every time or trying to sort of figure out where they need to go, or just go to the best possible source and go from there and start really working with those with that information is fantastic. So we will look out for that. We will put it on our Instagram when we find it. So thanks for letting us know. I think I have one more question before we close. The hour has flown by, as it always does. But so before we close, I'm just going to ask you this one last question. How would you recommend distilling this information for a university project? Would it be beneficial to critique existing frameworks and make your own for a specific project, and then use it to measure the success of the design, or to use an existing framework to measure your thesis? I guess it just touches a little bit on my last point, but
I think there's two parts to that. I think the first is try and attempt to set up a carbon management plan for the project. I think that's a really good exercise. It doesn't have to be a long document. We're talking about something that only needs to be a few pages, but it needs to touch on some key things. It needs to understand the scope of the project. So it's those activities I talked about. What's the scope that you're trying to achieve? Is it whole life, embodied operation, all of those? Trying to understand some sort of target that you're trying to attain. Understanding who would be responsible for which elements of actioning that plan. That would be a really, I think, useful thing to do. And then looking at the life cycle assessment itself, I recall from my days at university trying to grapple with energy estimate software. It's quite a daunting task. Maybe partnering up with someone that's working in services engineering at university might be a good place to start. But maybe also then in terms of looking at embodied carbon, I think it is worthwhile to try and set up your own analysis. I think even if you're just focusing on one element of the building, maybe the facade, there's a good amount of data out there. Arup have recently published a paper on looking at typical facade types and trying to set embodied carbon benchmarks. just doing one element of the building and creating a methodology that doesn't have to be complicated, but saying I'm going to look at 6 facade types. I'm going to consider the data sources from these databases or these papers, and then I'm going to try different configurations of those different systems and see what the outcome is. I think starting there is a lot more meaningful and will be a lot more used to you when you go into practice, because that's a valuable analytical tool that you can use to help decision making. Trying to do an entire whole life embodied carbon analysis from front to back is a huge undertaking, and I think you would give up hope quite quickly. I think with all the other things you've got to do to deliver your projects, I think that's probably the most useful thing, and something you can demonstrate in an interview that you're able to do. You're able to put that sort of critical thinking together and apply it to a specific use case within embodied carbon.
Fantastic. That was just such an incredibly clear and concise recommendation and description. So thank you very much. And if I can persuade you or tempt you to come and have a look at some of our students' attempts, perhaps anyone out there who's feeling now inspired to take this on, I think that would be fantastic to do that at some point here in the studio. So absolutely. I think it is time for us to say goodbye. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, everybody, for joining today, and look forward to seeing you all next week with the Department for Education. I don't have a particular name. I don't think the whole department is coming to meet us, but look forward to that. And yes, good luck with COP and all the activities there. We'll keep our eyes open for what goes on. And I welcome you to the studio soon, I hope.
That would be more than happy to. More than happy to come in and critique some attempts at doing that sort of comparative analysis. And thanks again for inviting me.
Well, thanks again, and good luck with all the targets. Cheerio, everybody. Back to your afternoons.